This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. In this narration, we'll journey back over 6,000 years to explore the Badarian culture, one of ancient Egypt's earliest and most fascinating prehistoric societies. Discovered along the Nile Valley, the Badarians were skilled artisans and farmers who laid crucial foundations for the civilization that would follow. We'll examine their remarkable pottery, sophisticated burial practices, and daily life along the river's edge. Together, we'll uncover how these pioneering people helped shape the emergence of one of history's greatest civilizations. Chapter 1. The Question of Origins. When archaeologists Guy Brunton and Gertrude Caton Thompson first excavated the cemeteries near El Badari between 1922 and 1931, they found over 3,000 graves spanning 500 years of continuous occupation. The skeletal remains from these graves, 117 skulls sufficiently preserved for detailed measurement, bones bearing traces of ancient diseases and injuries, even preserved hair showing variations in color and texture, would become the raw material for a scientific controversy that persists to this day. Who were these people who lived along the Nile around 4400 BC? Where had they come from? Were they indigenous to the Nile Valley, immigrants from the Sahara or the South, colonists from the Mediterranean or the Near East? The debate over Badarian origins became far more than an academic question about ancient population movements. It intersected with modern politics, colonial ideologies, and competing visions of African history. During the colonial era, European scholars often portrayed ancient Egypt as fundamentally distinct from sub-Saharan Africa, attributing its achievements to Mediterranean or Near Eastern peoples. Later, scholars like Sheikh Anta Diop argued forcefully for Egypt's African origins, challenging narratives that had minimized or denied connections between pharaonic civilization and the rest of the continent. The bones of long-dead farmers thus became contested evidence in debates about race, cultural achievement, and the place of Africa in world history. Early racial classifications. British Africanist Basil Davidson observed in the 1990s that the earliest southern Egyptian farmers, the Tasian and Badarian communities, were close neighbors of the Middle Nile peoples. In his assessment, they would have emerged from regions southwest or west of the Nile territories. Davidson envisioned the early Egyptians as belonging to wide communities that lived between the Red Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, sharing what he termed a common Saharan Sudanese culture. In 1971, physical anthropologist Eugene Strouhal examined 117 Badarian skulls and reached a conclusion that would be repeatedly cited and contested for decades. Using the racial categorization system then current, but now thoroughly discredited, he concluded that the distribution of Badarian skulls extended from what he termed the Europoid to the Negroid range. Of the total collection, 94 skulls showed what he classified as mixed features. Though he noted that the share of what he called pure Negroes were small, only 6 to 8%, he argued that the high proportion of mixed forms suggested a long-lasting dispersion of African genes in the population. Strouhal also documented details about preserved hair from the crania. In his first series, 6 cases showed curly hair, 33 showed wavy hair, and 10 showed straight hair. The colors ranged from 16 samples of black to 11 dark brown, 12 brown, 1 light brown, and 11 gray. By 2007, Strouhal would characterize the physical features of ancient A-group Nubians as not distinguishable from contemporary Predynastic Upper Egyptians of the Badarian and Naqadan cultures. He suggested that Predynastic Egyptians seemed similar to the Capsian culture of North Africa and to Berbers. In 1993, anthropologist C. Loring Brace and his colleagues conducted a craniofacial study that arrived at a strikingly different interpretation. They concluded that the pre-dynastic people of Upper Egypt and the late dynastic inhabitants of Lower Egypt were more closely related to each other than to any other population. As a whole, these ancient Egyptians showed ties with the European Neolithic, North Africa, modern Europe, and more remotely India, but not at all with Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Asia, Oceania, or the New World. Cranial Studies Reconsidered, biological anthropologist Eso Yoy Keita conducted his own craniometric analysis in 1990, which included early pre-dynastic Badarian skulls as well as Naqada the first specimens. Both series, he found, clustered with tropical Africans, with the Naqada series overlapping with remains from Kerma in Sudan. In 2005, Keita undertook a more detailed examination of Badarian crania from pre-dynastic Upper Egypt, comparing them to European skulls from Norway and Hungary, as well as various tropical African crania from southern Africa, Mali, and Kenya. The pre-dynastic Badarian series clustered much closer with the tropical African series than with the European samples. Keita pointed out methodological problems with the Brace study. The 1993 analysis had excluded the Maghreb, Sudan, and the Horn of Africa from its designated sub-Saharan group samples, treating sub-Saharan Africa as nearly monolithic when in fact it encompasses enormous diversity. When Keita expanded his analysis to include material from Sudan, late dynastic northern Egypt at Giza, Somalia, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, the Badarian series proved most similar to populations from the northeast quadrant of Africa and then to other Africans. Moreover, while Brace's team had claimed the post-Badarian southern pre-dynastic remains clustered primarily with Europeans, Keita noted that within the primary cluster, alongside Egyptian groups, there were also remains representing populations from ancient Sudan and recent Somalia. By 2008, Keita's findings became more nuanced. He determined that early pre-dynastic groups in southern Egypt, including Badarian skeletal samples, were similar to Nile Valley material from areas both south and north of Upper Egypt. Based on 9 variables, the dynastic Egyptians from both Upper and Lower Egypt showed much closer affinities with included Northeast African populations than with Europeans. The late dynastic Egyptians proved more similar to Europeans than earlier populations had been. Anthropologists Kanya Gaude evaluated population relationships in 2009 by comparing cranial traits in 12 Nubian and Egyptian groups spanning from the Badarian period through later eras. Her results showed small biological distances between these groups, indicating there may have been gene flow among these populations or a common adaptation to similar environments. Significantly, the Badarians, Naqadans, and Kerma Nubian samples clustered closely despite differences in their time periods. In a 2020 study, Gaude analyzed crania, including 2 Egyptian series, the pre-dynastic Badarian and Naqada populations, alongside A-group Nubians and a Bronze Age series from Lachish in Palestine. The 2 pre-dynastic Egyptian series showed the strongest affinities to each other, followed by closeness between the Naqada and Nubian series. These cranial studies, taken together, suggest that the Badarians were biologically most similar to other populations in northeast Africa, particularly those in the Nile Valley and adjacent regions. The variation within Badarian skulls likely reflected the same kind of population diversity found throughout the region rather than indicating a simple mixture of distinct racial groups. Dental evidence. Researchers also examined dental traits, which can provide different information than skull shape. A 2007 study by Joel D. Irish and Lyle Konigsberg re-examined earlier findings in light of recent archaeological and dental morphological data, concluding that their inspection of craniometric samples indicated a Badarian affiliation to North Africans rather than Sub-Saharan samples. However, a detailed thesis study of dental traits from Badarian fossils found they were closely related to other Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations inhabiting northeast Africa and the Maghreb. Among ancient populations, the Badarians proved nearest to other ancient Egyptians from sites like Naqada, Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Karga in Upper Egypt, as well as to C group and Pharaonic-era skeletons from Lower Nubia. Among recent groups, the Badarian dental markers were morphologically closest to the Shawiya and Kabyle Berber populations of Algeria, as well as Bedouin groups in Morocco, Libya, and Tunisia, followed by other Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations in the Horn of Africa. The dental evidence reinforces connections across northeast Africa and the Sahara, pointing to long-standing population continuity and interaction across these regions, rather than sharp boundaries or sudden population replacements. Skeletal proportions and climate adaptation. The analysis of limb proportions added another dimension to the discussion. Sonia Zakrashevsky found in 2003 that samples from the Badarian through the Middle Kingdom in Upper Egypt had what she termed tropical body plans. Their limb indices were actually longer relative to body size than in many African populations, what she called supernegroid proportions. She proposed that the apparent development of an increasingly African body plan over time might be due to Nubian mercenaries being included in later samples, though she noted that all samples clustered relatively together compared to other populations. Zakrashevsky emphasized that her results remained provisional due to relatively small sample sizes and lack of skeletal material representing all social and economic groups within each time period. Michelle Raxter's 2011 examination of limb proportions and body sizes in ancient Egyptians, which included skeletal remains from the Badarian period, found that ancient Egyptians had more tropically adapted limbs in comparison to body breadths, which tended to be intermediate when plotted against higher and lower latitude populations. These results, Raxter suggested, might reflect the greater plasticity of limb lengths compared to body breadth, or might indicate early Mediterranean or Near Eastern influence in Northeast Africa. Methodological limitations and integration. The limitations of drawing conclusions from physical measurements alone became increasingly apparent. Cranial morphology can be influenced by various factors: environmental conditions during growth, nutritional status, genetic admixture, that may not accurately reflect genetic ancestry. Soy Peta stressed that cranial metrics alone are insufficient for determining discrete biological populations, especially in regions with significant genetic diversity and historical population movements. Different researchers using different comparison samples or different measurement techniques could reach contradictory conclusions from the same skeletal material. Genetic evidence. By the early 21st century, researchers increasingly advocated for integrating multiple lines of evidence. No predynastic Badarian material had been successfully sequenced at the time most of these debates unfolded. Various DNA studies of later populations found that Christian-era and modern Nubians, along with modern Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations in the Horn of Africa, descended from a mixture of West Eurasian and African populations. But applying these findings backward to the Badarians remained speculative. Several scholars highlighted methodological limitations in applying DNA studies to Egyptian mummified remains, and historian William Stibling and archaeologist Susan Helft noted that conflicting DNA analyses had led to a lack of consensus on the genetic makeup of ancient Egyptians and their geographic origins. A 2025 genetic analysis offered more concrete clues. Studies of the modern Upper Egyptian population at Adima identified genetic markers common across Africa, with 71% of samples carrying the E1b1 haplogroup and 3% carrying the L0f mitochondrial haplogroup. An anthropological study of a predynastic cemetery at Adima from 3700 BC found notable presence of dental markers characteristic of Khoisan people, 25% among several children's teeth. Geneticist Jean-Philippe Gourdin marshaled correlative sources of linguistic, anthropological, paleontological, and genetic evidence demonstrating African affinities with specific Neolithic and Predynastic remains at the Naqada, Badari, and Adima sites in Upper Egypt. Modern scholarly consensus, the 2025 UNESCO Multidisciplinary Review brought together perspectives from archaeology, linguistics, physical anthropology, and population genetics. 60 scholars from 28 countries contributed to this comprehensive analysis, overseen by a 16-member international scientific committee appointed by UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay. Alain Ancelin, reviewing the 1974 symposium conclusions, stated that research accumulated over 3 decades had confirmed migration of peoples from the Sahara and regions south of Egypt to the Nile Valley. Christopher Arrett, writing in 2023, synthesized physical anthropological findings from multiple researchers and concluded that the major burial sites of Egypt's founding locales in the 4th millennium BC, notably El Badari and Naqada, showed no demographic indebtedness to the Levant. These studies revealed cranial and dental affinities with closest parallels to other long-time populations in the surrounding areas of northeastern Africa, such as Nubia and the northern Horn of Africa. Members of this population, Arrett argued, did not come from somewhere else, but were descendants of long-term inhabitants of these portions of Africa going back many millennia. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Distinctive burial practices revealed in Badarian cemeteries show clear continuity with traditions visible at sites like Nabta Playa in the Sahara, suggesting cultural connections across the greening and later desiccating desert. The people buried in those ancient cemeteries near the Nile were neither simply migrants from one direction, nor purely indigenous to a single location, but rather the product of long-term population dynamics in northeastern Africa during a period of dramatic environmental change as the Sahara dried. Their physical remains, their cultural practices, and now their genetic markers all point toward deep roots in the African landscape, shaped by millennia of adaptation to the unique environment of the Nile Valley and surrounding regions. Chapter 2. The Dead Face West. The first Badarian graves revealed something far more elaborate than simple disposal of the dead. These were not hasty burials. Each grave told a story of careful preparation, specific orientation, and deliberate inclusion of objects meant to accompany the deceased into whatever lay beyond. The consistency of these practices across hundreds of burials revealed a people who had developed clear beliefs about death and what came after. The graves themselves were simple in construction, oval or circular pits dug into the desert sand, usually quite shallow. But simplicity of form did not mean simplicity of purpose. Each pit measured roughly large enough to accommodate a human body in a contracted position, neither carelessly small nor wastefully large. The locations mattered too. Badarian cemeteries clustered on the outskirts of settlements, positioned in the low desert away from the fertile Nile floodplain where crops grew. This separation of the living and the dead would become a defining characteristic of Egyptian culture for millennia, but the Badarians were among the first to establish it as a consistent practice. Before placing a body in its grave, the Badarians often prepared the pit bottom with a woven reed mat. The craftsmanship of these mats varied. Some were tightly woven and carefully laid, others more roughly made, but their presence indicated forethought. Someone had taken the time to create a barrier between the deceased and the bare earth, a final bed for the journey ahead. In some graves, excavators found what appeared to be pillows fashioned from straw or animal skins, positioned where the head would rest. These small gestures of comfort suggest the Badarians did not view death as an ending that rendered the deceased insensible to their surroundings. The positioning of the body followed a pattern so consistent it could not have been accidental. The deceased lay on their left side, knees drawn up in a loosely contracted fetal position, not tightly curled but gently folded. The head pointed south, and crucially, the face turned toward the west, toward the setting sun, toward the direction that would become, in later Egyptian belief, the realm of Osiris and the afterlife. That the Badarians already associated the West with death suggests they had developed a cosmology linking the daily disappearance of the sun with human mortality, perhaps seeing in the sun's nightly journey into darkness a parallel to the soul's journey after death. Before the body was placed in the grave, it was wrapped. Some of the dead wore simple linen loincloths, indicating they had not been buried naked. Over or around the body, mourners arranged coverings of reed matting or animal skins, sometimes gazelle hide, sometimes cattle hide. The wrapping served practical purposes in the hot climate, but it also created a cocoon, a boundary between the individual and the earth that would eventually claim them. Some bodies received more elaborate treatment than others. The variation in wrapping materials and techniques hints at differences in status or wealth, but everybody received some form of covering, some acknowledgement of the transition being marked. What the Badarians placed beside their dead reveals volumes about how they understood the afterlife. These were not symbolic gestures, but practical provisions. Pottery vessels, often the beautiful black-topped ware with its distinctive rippled surface, filled the graves. These were not empty ceremonial pieces. Chemical analysis of residues in similar vessels from later periods has shown they contained food, grain, beer, perhaps stews or porridge. The Badarians anticipated that their dead would need to eat and drink, that whatever existence awaited them would include familiar physical needs. The graves held more than sustenance. Personal possessions surrounded the deceased, items that had belonged to them in life and would serve them in death. Shells from the Red Sea, some pierced for stringing into necklaces, lay near many bodies. These shells required long-distance trade networks to acquire, making them valuable objects. That families were willing to bury such valuables with the dead rather than keeping them for the living speaks to the strength of their belief that these items would actually reach and benefit the deceased. Flint tools accompanied many burials. Not crude implements, but carefully crafted pieces. Bifacial sickles with precisely worked edges. Concave base arrowheads showing sophisticated knapping techniques. Knives with sharp blades. Axes with polished surfaces. A person's tools were extensions of their identity, markers of their role in the community. A hunter's weapons, a craftsperson's implements, a farmer's blade. These defined who someone had been and apparently who they would continue to be. The cosmetic items found in Badarian graves are particularly revealing. Stone palettes, often made of slate or greywacca, show traces of ground malachite, the green mineral that could be mixed into paste for eye paint. The Badarians had not simply thrown a palette into the grave. They had used it, left residue on its surface, included it as a functional object. Cosmetic spoons carved from ivory, decorative combs with fine teeth, bracelets and necklaces of stone and shell beads, all these items related to personal adornment and beauty. The implication is striking. The Badarians believed appearance mattered after death. The deceased would want to present themselves well in whatever realm they entered, just as they had presented themselves in life. Copper beads and pins appear in many graves, sometimes in remarkable quantities. Copper was not easy to obtain. It had to be imported, making it a precious metal that required access to long-distance trade networks. Working it into beads or pins required technical skill and access to high temperatures for smelting and shaping. Yet the Badarians regularly buried these precious metal objects rather than recycling them for the living. The practice makes economic sense only if we accept that they viewed the afterlife as a real destination, where such items retained value. Among the most intriguing grave goods are the small figurines found in numerous Badarian burials. Carved from ivory or molded from clay, these figurines almost always depict women. The craftsmanship varies. Some are quite crude, others show considerable artistic skill, but the subject remains consistent. The female figures often have exaggerated hips and breasts, suggesting fertility or motherhood. Their arms are sometimes raised, sometimes lowered, sometimes appear to be holding objects. What did these figurines represent? The conventional interpretation labels them fertility idols, objects meant to ensure continued reproduction or agricultural abundance. But their placement in graves with individual dead people suggests something more personal. Perhaps they served as companions for the deceased, spiritual attendants for the journey ahead. Perhaps they represented protective deities or ancestral spirits. Some scholars have suggested they might be portraits of deceased family members, mothers, or wives being symbolically reunited with the departed. Without written records to explain their meaning, we can only observe that the Badarians considered these female figures important enough to craft with care and include in burial after burial. Amulets in animal shapes accompanied many dead Badarians. Small carvings of hippopotamuses, antelopes, and other creatures were tucked into graves, sometimes multiple animals in a single burial. Ivory vessels were even carved in the shapes of hippopotamuses, extending animal symbolism beyond personal adornments to functional objects. These were not children's toys, though similar objects might have served that purpose for the living. In a funerary context, they likely held protective or symbolic meaning. The hippopotamus, dangerous and powerful, perhaps offered protection or represented strength. The antelope, swift and graceful, might have symbolized successful hunting or the speed of the soul's journey. We see here the beginning of animal symbolism that would explode into the elaborate Egyptian pantheon of later millennia, with its jackal-headed Anubis, falcon-headed Horus, and lioness-headed Sekhmet. The Badarians extended their burial practices beyond humans. In cemeteries and near settlements, archaeologists have found graves containing cattle, sheep, goats, and dogs, domestic animals given their own burial rites. Some were simply interred. Others received more elaborate treatment, buried with grave goods of their own, positioned with care. The cattle burials are particularly significant. These large animals represented substantial economic value. A living cow provided milk, labor, eventual meat, and hide. Yet the Badarians chose to bury some cattle rather than consume them, suggesting these animals held religious or social significance beyond their practical utility. The practice of cattle burial connects the Badarians to wider African traditions. At Nabta Playa, roughly contemporary with the Badarian culture, cattle were buried in stone-roofed chambers lined with clay, tombs more elaborate than those for humans. This cattle cult appears to represent one of the earliest expressions of the religious significance that would later attach to Hathor, the Egyptian goddess depicted as a cow or with cow horns, associated with motherhood, love, and the sky. The Badarian cattle burials may represent an early stage in the development of this complex of beliefs. Even dogs received burial among the Badarians. These animals, neither food sources nor labor animals in the way cattle were, served as companions and hunting assistants. That they merited burial suggests the Badarians recognized relationships with animals as significant enough to honor in death, or believed these hunting companions might be needed in an afterlife that included the same activities as life. Not all Badarian graves were equal. This inequality tells us as much about Badarian society as the common elements do. Some graves clustered in particular areas of cemeteries, spatially separated from others. These separated zones consistently held bodies accompanied by richer assemblages of grave goods, more pottery vessels, more jewelry, more imported materials, more carefully crafted items. The graves themselves were sometimes larger, sometimes included additional features like wooden elements or more elaborate matting. This spatial separation, combined with wealth differences, points unmistakably to social stratification. The Badarian community included individuals or families who commanded greater resources and expected to maintain their status even in death. Whether this hierarchy derived from success in agriculture, control of trade routes, religious authority, or inherited status, we cannot determine from graves alone. But the pattern itself is clear. Badarian society had begun to develop the kind of inequality that would eventually support kings and pyramids. The richest Badarian graves attracted attention in antiquity, not always the kind their occupants or descendants would have wanted. Many of these elaborate burials show signs of having been robbed, sometimes apparently quite soon after the original internment. Thieves dug down into the graves, disturbed the bodies, removed valuables, and departed. The robbing of graves demonstrates something important. The grave goods were not merely symbolic to the Badarians. They had actual value that could be stolen and used by the living. The beliefs that motivated families to bury precious items with their dead coexisted with the practical recognition that these items retained their worth and could be reclaimed.
That grave robbing happened so soon after burial suggests the robbers were likely members of the same community, people who knew which graves contained the most valuable goods. This creates a fascinating tension in Badarian society. Strong enough beliefs in the afterlife to motivate elaborate burial practices, yet weak enough social controls or strong enough economic pressures to allow violation of those same graves. Perhaps the robbers rationalized that they were only taking material goods while the deceased had already departed for the afterlife. Perhaps desperation overcame religious scruple. Or perhaps Badarian belief, like many religious systems, was stronger in some individuals than others, creating space for the cynical to exploit the faithful. What emerges from these hundreds of graves is a picture of a people who had developed a complex set of beliefs about death and what followed it. The consistency of body position, the westward orientation, the provision of food and tools and adornments, all these practices required effort and resources. They were not the minimum necessary to dispose of a body, but an investment in an imagined future for the deceased. The westward orientation, the animal symbolism, the cattle cult, all connect to wider African traditions visible at sites like Naqada Playa. Yet the specific combination of practices, the particular grave goods chosen, the emerging social hierarchy visible in differential treatment of the dead, these show the Badarians developing their own distinctive tradition. But beliefs alone do not explain how a society organizes itself. The graves that separated the wealthy from the common dead were symptoms of changes happening in Badarian settlements and fields. How did a culture of farmers and herders develop such pronounced inequality? The answer lies not in their treatment of the dead, but in their organization of the living. Chapter 3: Surplus and Power. The graves tell us that Badarian society was unequal, but graves only capture a moment, the moment of death and burial. To understand how that inequality emerged and functioned in daily life, we must look beyond the cemeteries to the settlements where the Badarians lived, worked, and accumulated the resources that would eventually follow some of them into the ground. The Badarian settlements themselves present immediate challenges to archaeologists. Unlike the durable graves dug into desert sand, the places where the Badarians lived have largely vanished. Their homes were built from lightweight materials, wooden posts or frames covered with reed mats, perhaps animal skins, possibly mud-plastered wattle. When abandoned, these structures collapsed or were dismantled, their organic components decomposing or being scavenged for reuse. What remains are shadows, post holes marking where supports once stood, hearths where fires burned, and most significantly, pits dug into the ground. These settlements, though many are poorly preserved, were scattered along the Nile between modern Matmar and Kau. These pits are crucial to understanding Badarian inequality. Scattered throughout settlement areas, they vary considerably in size and apparent function. Some are small, shallow depressions that likely served as hearths or work areas. Others are much larger, deeper, and more carefully constructed. The walls of these larger pits sometimes show evidence of having been lined with baskets or plastered with clay. Their shape and size correspond to no domestic purpose except one, the storage of grain.
A granary is not simply a hole in the ground. It represents planning, surplus, and control. To fill a storage pit with grain, a farmer must first grow more than their family immediately needs. This requires productive land, successful cultivation, favorable weather, and enough labor to plant, tend, and harvest a crop larger than subsistence demands. Once filled, that granary becomes a form of wealth, portable, valuable, essential for survival. It can be consumed during lean seasons, traded for other goods, used to feed laborers for construction or craft work, or kept as insurance against crop failure. The archaeological evidence shows that some Badarian households controlled larger storage facilities than others. This variation was not random. The sites with the largest and most numerous storage pits tend to cluster near particularly fertile stretches of land or at locations that would have facilitated trade. The same households that built substantial granaries were, based on associated material remains, also the ones with better crafted tools, more imported goods, and eventually the richest graves. How did this inequality originate? The Badarian culture emerged during the crucial transition from mobile foraging to settled agriculture in Upper Egypt. During the earlier Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods, the region had supported hunter-gatherer groups who moved seasonally, following game and gathering wild plants. These mobile societies tend toward egalitarianism. When you must carry all your possessions, accumulation becomes a burden rather than an advantage. Leadership might emerge based on skill, knowledge, or charisma, but without the ability to accumulate and store surplus, such leadership rarely becomes hereditary or economically based.
Agriculture changes everything. When people settle in one place and invest labor in cultivating particular plots of land, some locations prove more productive than others. A family farming a plot where the annual Nile flood deposited particularly rich silt would harvest more grain than neighbors on less fertile ground. Over generations, these small advantages compound. The more successful farm produces surplus, which can feed more people, allowing larger families or the support of additional laborers. More laborers can work more land or work it more intensively, producing even greater surplus. The cycle reinforces itself. But soil quality alone cannot explain the full extent of Badarian inequality. As documented in Chapter 2, the richest graves contain items that no farming family, however successful, could produce themselves. Shells from the Red Sea, turquoise possibly from Sinai, copper that had to be mined and smelted, exotic stones quarried far from the Nile Valley. These goods arrived through trade networks that extended hundreds of kilometers in multiple directions. Someone in Badarian society controlled access to these networks or commanded the surplus agricultural products that could be exchanged for imported luxuries. The settlements at the Badari region occupied strategic positions. Located on the east bank of the Nile, they sat between the fertile river valley and the routes leading into the eastern desert. The eastern desert was not the barren wasteland it is today. During the Badarian period, greater rainfall supported more vegetation and wildlife. More importantly, the desert contained mineral resources, copper deposits, semi-precious stones, and routes connecting the Nile Valley to the Red Sea coast. Control of these routes would have enabled certain Badarian leaders to position themselves as middlemen in trade, extracting value from goods passing in both directions. The evidence for craft specialization reinforces the picture of an increasingly complex economy. Badarian pottery reached a level of technical sophistication that required dedicated practice. The finest examples, thin-walled vessels with carefully burnished surfaces and the distinctive black-topped finish, could not have been produced by casual part-time potters. The manufacturing process required precise control of firing conditions, knowledge of clay properties, and considerable skill in shaping. Yet not everyone in Badarian society possessed such skills or produced such pottery. The distribution of pottery-making equipment and waste materials in settlements shows that production concentrated at specific locations, presumably in the hands of specialists who exchanged their products for food and other goods. The same pattern appears with stone tools. While every Badarian household likely possessed basic flint tools, the finest examples, large bifacial knives, carefully shaped sickle blades, perfectly symmetrical arrowheads, required expertise that went well beyond functional necessity. These were not merely tools, but display pieces, markers of status and wealth.
The labor invested in creating them made sense only in an economy where some individuals could afford to commission or purchase items that exceeded practical requirements. Metalworking represented an even higher level of specialization. Copper tools and ornaments appear in Badarian contexts, representing one of the earliest uses of metal in Egypt. Unlike stoneworking, which could be learned through observation and practice using locally available materials, copperworking required specialized knowledge at every stage. Someone had to know where to find copper ore, how to recognize it, how to transport it back to settlements. Then came the technical challenges of smelting, heating the ore to temperatures high enough to extract the metal, a process requiring specially constructed furnaces and carefully managed fires fueled with specific materials. Finally, the extracted copper had to be shaped into useful objects through hammering, annealing, and further finishing work.
This entire process demanded resources and knowledge that far exceeded what any single household could possess. A successful copperworking operation required patronage, someone with enough accumulated wealth to support specialists who produced metal objects rather than food, someone who could organize the procurement of ore from distant sources, someone with the authority to allocate the finished products. The presence of copper goods in Badarian society thus implies not just technical knowledge, but social structures that could support and direct specialized production. The ivory figurines found in Badarian graves similarly point to specialized craftspeople working for elite patrons. Carving elephant ivory requires not just artistic skill, but access to the raw material, which had to be imported from the south, from regions where elephants still lived. The finest examples show sophisticated understanding of the material's properties, ability to visualize three-dimensional forms, and the patience to execute detailed work on a small scale. These were not objects anyone could make. They were commissioned pieces created by skilled artisans for wealthy clients who could afford to import exotic materials and pay for expert labor.
The organization of Badarian settlements reflects emerging hierarchy in spatial terms as well. While the lightweight construction materials make reconstructing individual buildings difficult, the overall layout of sites shows patterns. At some locations, larger structures or compound areas appear separated from clusters of smaller dwellings. These may represent household size differences, extended families, or households including dependents and workers living in larger spaces than nuclear families. Or they may indicate functional differences, with some structures serving as workshops, storage facilities, or gathering places rather than simple residences. The evidence suggests controlled production spaces and restricted access to valuable resources developed even in these early settlements. The evidence from contemporary sites elsewhere in Egypt provides context for understanding Badarian developments. In Lower Egypt, the Merimde culture flourished at roughly the same time as the Badarian. Merimde settlements show less evidence of social stratification than Badarian sites. Their graves, documented from approximately 600 burials, are simpler and more uniform, containing fewer grave goods and showing less differentiation in wealth. The material culture is less diverse, imports are rarer, and specialized craft production is less evident. This contrast suggests that something specific about conditions in Upper Egypt, perhaps the geography that made the region a crossroads for north-south and east-west trade, perhaps the particular productivity of the agricultural lands, perhaps cultural factors we cannot fully recover, enabled or encouraged the development of inequality at Badari, while more egalitarian systems persisted elsewhere.
The question of whether Badarian inequality was inherited or achieved remains difficult to answer definitively. Did children born to wealthy families automatically inherit their parents' status and resources, creating a hereditary elite? Or could ambitious, skilled, or lucky individuals rise to wealth within their lifetimes? The grave evidence offers tantalizing hints. Some of the richest burials are of individuals who were quite young at death, even children. A child cannot have achieved wealth through their own efforts, which suggests their status derived from family position.
Yet other rich graves contain adults buried with tools and equipment suggesting they practiced specific crafts or professions, perhaps indicating that individual achievement still mattered, that skill could translate into wealth and status. The presence of both children and craftspeople in wealthy graves might indicate a society in transition, where older patterns of achievement-based status coexisted with emerging hereditary privilege. The most successful farmers, traders, or craft specialists could accumulate wealth in their lifetimes and likely enjoyed social prestige. But increasingly, they could also pass resources to their children, land rights, trade connections, stockpiled goods, and the social relationships that had enabled their own success. Over generations, this created family lines that maintained privileged positions regardless of individual members' personal abilities.
The gender dynamics of Badarian inequality remain frustratingly opaque. As documented in the burial patterns, graves of both men and women contain rich assemblages of goods, suggesting that women as well as men could hold high status. But whether women achieved this status through their own efforts, through marriage to high-status men, or through inheritance from parents is impossible to determine from burial evidence alone. The prominence of female figurines in Badarian culture might suggest that women held important religious or symbolic roles, but the leap from symbolic importance to actual social power is one the evidence does not support making definitively.
What emerges from the Badarian settlements in their graves is a picture of rapid social transformation. Within perhaps 500 years of the initial adoption of settled agriculture in Upper Egypt, the society had developed distinct social classes visible in both the granaries of the living and the graves of the dead. Control of surplus grain created the foundation for everything else. The ability to support craft specialists, to accumulate trade goods, to maintain larger households, to invest in monumental expressions of wealth and status. The mechanisms were simple: better land, more labor, strategic positioning for trade, and the organizational capacity to coordinate specialized production. But the consequences were profound. The Badarians had created the economic and social structures that would support the increasingly complex societies to come, where concentrated wealth would enable not just rich burials, but temples, fortresses, and eventually pyramids. Yet the trade networks that brought exotic goods to Badarian graves connected these farming communities to distant worlds. Where did these networks reach, and how did contact with other cultures shape Badarian development? Chapter 4. Trading with Distant Worlds. The fragment of hard pink ware found at a Badarian site tells a story that travels across more than 1,000 kilometers. This four-handled pot, distinctive in its material and manufacture, could not have been made along the Nile. Its clay composition matches nothing found in Egypt. The shape itself, four handles arranged symmetrically around a sturdy vessel, follows patterns known from coastal Syria-Palestine, from settlements facing the Mediterranean Sea. Pottery from Telephone El Farka was found to have been made from clay not present in the region, confirming it was manufactured and traded from the Levant. Somehow, these vessels made journeys from the Levantine coast, across desert or along coastal routes, through the Sinai or perhaps by ship along the Red Sea, finally arriving in the hands of Badarian families, who valued them enough to include them in burials. This evidence demolishes the conventional image of early farming communities as isolated villages, largely self-sufficient and fundamentally inward-looking. The Badarians were people embedded in exchange networks that stretched to the limits of the known world in the 5th millennium BCE. Understanding these networks requires thinking beyond simple one-to-one exchange. A Badarian farmer did not travel to Syria to fetch a pot. Instead, goods moved through chains of exchange, passing from hand to hand, community to community, sometimes over generations. Each transfer might involve different modes of exchange: gift-giving between allied groups, barter between strangers, tribute from subordinate to dominant communities, or transactions within kinship networks that spanned regions. The archaeological evidence reveals the directions and approximate volumes of these exchanges, but the mechanisms remain largely invisible. We can identify what arrived at Badarian sites and where it came from. We can infer that something went in the opposite direction. You cannot import without exporting. But what the Badarians exported largely escapes detection. Their most likely export was agricultural surplus, which decays and leaves no trace in the archaeological record of distant sites. The routes to the south, connecting Badarian settlements with Nubia, would become among the most important in Egyptian history. During the Badarian period, this connection was already active. Ceramic vessels with decorative styles characteristic of Nubian cultures appear at Badarian sites, while Badarian-style pottery turns up in Nubian contexts to the south. This reciprocal movement indicates sustained contact, not just occasional expeditions. The Nile itself provided the highway. Unlike many rivers, the Nile flows from south to north, but the prevailing winds blow from north to south. This geographical fact meant that boats could drift or row downstream when traveling north, then raise a sail and let the wind push them back upstream when returning south. Early boats were probably simple reed vessels or timber rafts, but they were sufficient to carry goods and people along hundreds of kilometers of river.
Beyond simple transport, the Nubian connection brought materials unavailable in the Badarian heartland. Certain types of hard stone, particularly suitable for making pallets and vessels, came from the south. The porphyry slabs found at Badarian sites match geological formations in Nubia, though the material also exists in the Red Sea mountains. Gold, though not yet appearing in significant quantities in Badarian contexts, was known to exist in Nubian territories. The question of whether these connections involved direct Badarian expeditions to Nubia or intermediary communities handling transfers remains unresolved. Given that related cultural materials appear at sites between Badari and Deep Nubia, the intermediary model seems more likely. Goods moved through a series of communities, each maintaining relationships with neighbors rather than requiring long-distance expeditions. The routes to the east, connecting the Nile Valley with the Red Sea coast, crossed terrain that was less forbidding in the Badarian period than it is today. The eastern desert received more rainfall, supporting more vegetation and making travel less dangerous. The Wadi Hammamat, one of the main routes through the eastern desert, shows evidence of Badarian presence. Distinctive artifacts have been found at sites along this route, indicating it was known and used.
The Red Sea coast offered resources that drew Badarian interest. Shells in quantities appear at Badarian sites, species that live only in Red Sea waters. These were not food remains but raw materials for adornment. The shells were often pierced for stringing into necklaces or bracelets, sometimes ground and polished, occasionally carved with simple decorations. The labor involved in acquiring these shells, the journey to the coast, collecting the shells, transporting them back, made them valuable objects whose presence in graves signals that the deceased or their families could command resources to obtain materials from a region several days' travel away. More intriguingly, the Red Sea represented potential access to a much wider world. The Red Sea connects to the Indian Ocean, and by the 4th millennium BCE, maritime trade networks were developing that would eventually link East Africa, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. Whether the Badarians themselves engaged in seafaring or merely accessed materials that had arrived at Red Sea ports through others' voyages remains unknown. The copper that appears in Badarian contexts most likely came from the Sinai Peninsula, though deposits in the eastern desert cannot be ruled out as sources. The Sinai mines would be systematically exploited by later Egyptian states, but the geological formations and ore outcrops were surely known earlier. Obtaining copper required not just knowledge of where to find ore, but the organization to mount expeditions to distant locations, the technical knowledge to recognize valuable ore, and the capability to transport heavy materials back across desert terrain.
The turquoise found at some Badarian sites probably also originated in Sinai, from deposits that would later be mined extensively.
Turquoise had no practical function. It could not be worked into useful tools. Its value was purely aesthetic, its blue-green color unusual and striking. That Badarians obtained and valued purely decorative materials demonstrates that their economy had developed beyond subsistence. They could afford to invest resources in acquiring items whose only purpose was beauty or status display. Obsidian, imported from Ethiopia, appears at Badarian sites, used to shape blades and other objects from flakes. This volcanic glass, prized for its sharp edges, traveled even greater distances than copper or turquoise, following trade routes that connected the Nile Valley with the Horn of Africa. The northwestern connections, linking Badarian sites with Lower Egypt and the Delta region, probably involved the most regular exchange. The Nile provided easy communication, and the distance from Badari to the southern delta was traversable in a few days of river travel. Basalt vessels found at Badarian sites most likely came from the Delta region or from volcanic outcrops in the northwestern desert. Basalt is a hard, dark volcanic stone that produces vessels with smooth, attractive surfaces. The presence of basalt vessels at Badarian sites indicates either that finished goods were imported or that basalt cobbles were brought south and worked locally.
Trade with the western oases was also likely, though the evidence is less clear. These oases, scattered across what is now the western desert, were more accessible during the Badarian period when the region received greater rainfall. They would have served as waypoints for longer routes stretching west across the Sahara. The pottery styles of Lower Egypt differed from those of the Badarian culture. Lower Egyptian ceramics tended to be simpler, less decorated, often coarser in manufacture. Yet examples of Lower Egyptian pottery appear at Badarian sites, and Badarian-style vessels turn up in the north. This exchange might have been driven more by curiosity about foreign styles than by functional superiority. A Badarian family displaying a pot from the Delta was displaying evidence of their participation in wider networks, even if the pot itself functioned no better than locally made vessels. The Syrian connection evidenced by that four-handled pot is among the most intriguing. The Levantine coast was already participating in maritime trade networks by the 5th millennium BCE. Cedar wood from Lebanese mountains was valuable throughout the region. Charcoal samples found in the tombs of Nekhen, dated to the Naqada I and II periods, have been identified as cedar from Lebanon, demonstrating the continuity of this timber trade. The wood itself was the primary attraction, useful for construction in a region where large trees were scarce. But along with the timber came objects, styles, and perhaps people. Whether this Levantine contact occurred through maritime routes, ships following the Mediterranean coast to the delta, then goods transferred overland and up the Nile, or through overland routes across Sinai remains debatable. Both routes were possible. The maritime route would have required more sophisticated vessels than simple Nile boats, but coastal navigation using landmarks was well within the capabilities of the period. The overland route would have meant crossing the Sinai Peninsula, a challenging but feasible journey, and one that would have allowed access to the copper and turquoise deposits along the way. The black pottery with white incised designs found at Badarian sites presents a different puzzle. This ware style has parallels in regions to the west and south, in the Sahara and in Sudan. The Sahara was not yet the absolute desert it would become. Though drying was underway as the African humid period ended, the landscape still supported human populations and even cattle herding in some regions. The connections with Saharan and Sudanese regions raise the possibility that Badarian cultural elements derived from populations moving out of the drying Sahara into the Nile Valley. Rather than simple trade in objects, this might represent population movement and cultural blending.
The glazed steatite beads found at Badarian sites provide evidence for technological knowledge transmission across regions. Steatite is a soft stone that can be carved easily, but glazing it, coating the surface with a glassy material that fuses when heated, requires specific technical knowledge. The glazing technique was developing in multiple regions during this period, including Mesopotamia and the Levant.
That it appears in Badarian contexts suggests either that the technical knowledge traveled through the same networks that moved trade goods, or that Egyptian craftspeople independently developed similar techniques in response to seeing glazed objects from elsewhere. The volume of imports at Badarian sites should not be overstated. The exotic materials are impressive, but quantitatively minor compared to locally produced goods. A typical grave might contain a dozen pottery vessels, of which one or two show signs of being imports or being made from imported materials. This pattern is exactly what we would expect from long-distance trade networks in the pre-state era. Such trade dealt in valuables, specialty goods, materials unavailable locally, not in bulk commodities. Yet even small quantities could have significant impact. The prestige of owning imported goods motivated individuals to intensify production of exportable surplus, driving agricultural development. Foreign objects inspired local craftspeople to develop new styles or techniques. Knowledge of valuable materials in specific locations could inspire expeditions to secure direct access, leading to geographical exploration and territorial expansion.
The organization required to maintain these trade networks reveals as much about Badarian society as the goods themselves. Someone coordinated expeditions to distant sources, managed stockpiling of agricultural surplus for exchange, maintained relationships with trading partners across years or generations, and distributed imported goods within communities. These coordinating functions probably fell to the same emerging elite whose wealth and status we see reflected in grave assemblages. Control of trade would have been both a source and a marker of status. Families that could consistently obtain copper, turquoise, or shells from the Red Sea demonstrated their capability, connections, and wealth through gifting exotic items to allies, reserving the finest imports for their own use, and controlling access to materials needed by craft specialists. The Badarians' participation in these extensive trade networks positioned them at a crossroads of cultural exchange. Ideas moved along the same routes as objects. Foreign pottery styles inspired local innovations. Technologies observed in distant regions were adapted to local conditions. This exposure to diverse cultures and materials likely contributed to the rapid cultural development visible in Badarian society. The Badarians were developing distinctively Egyptian cultural forms, westward-facing burials, specific pottery styles, particular combinations of agriculture and herding. But they were doing so in dialogue with Nubian, Saharan, and Levantine cultures. The transition to the Naqada culture would intensify these connections even further. The foundations were laid during the Badarian period, but the question remained: how would these external influences reshape Egyptian society as it moved toward increasing complexity and eventual unification? Chapter 5. The Naqada Transformation. The pottery tells the story before anything else does. Around 3800 BC, a new style began appearing in graves and settlements across Upper Egypt. The vessels retained the polished red bodies that the Badarians had mastered, but now artists painted them with patterns rendered in white or cream pigment. Close parallel white lines crossed other sets of close parallel white lines, creating geometric grids that covered the surface. Sometimes the lines formed triangular patterns. Sometimes they outlined natural forms, plants, perhaps abstract representations of water or sky. This white cross-lined wear marked the beginning of something new. The relationship between the Badarian culture and the Naqada culture that succeeded it has puzzled archaeologists since the two were first identified as distinct. The original interpretation treated them as sequential stages, Badarian first, then Naqada the first, replacing it cleanly around 4000 BC. But the archaeological reality proved messier than this neat chronology suggested. About 40 settlements and 600 graves have been located for the Badarian culture, which might have already emerged by 5000 BC. The Badari region itself shows surprisingly little evidence of early Naqada I occupation.
Meanwhile, sites to the south, at Naqada itself, at Hierakonpolis, at locations along a considerable stretch of the Upper Nile, were flourishing with assemblages that combined Badarian elements with newer forms.
This geographical pattern suggests the two cultures may have overlapped in time, occupying different regions simultaneously, before Naqada eventually spread northward into Badarian territory. The transition was not a sharp break, but a gradual blending, a process of cultural replacement that took centuries and varied by location. What remained constant across the transition tells us as much as what changed. The fundamental subsistence base stayed the same. Both Badarians and early Naqadans farmed wheat and barley, herded cattle and sheep and goats, fished the Nile, and occasionally hunted. Both used similar tool types, flint blades, bone needles, stone pallets. Both participated in long-distance trade networks. But layered over these continuities were changes that would accelerate and intensify. The Naqada settlements were larger than their Badarian predecessors. While Badarian villages consisted of perhaps a few dozen families, early Naqada sites housed hundreds of people, sometimes more. This growth reflected agricultural intensification, but also suggested new forms of social organization capable of coordinating larger communities. The pottery changes went beyond just the introduction of white cross-lined decoration. The Naqadans developed a wider variety of vessel forms, deeper bowls, taller jars, specialized shapes for specific purposes. By the Naqada II period, potters were painting elaborate scenes on vessel surfaces, boats with multiple oars, human figures engaged in hunting or ritual activities, wild animals in procession, geometric patterns that may have carried symbolic meanings we can no longer decode.
The appearance of decorated pottery depicting recognizable scenes marks a cognitive shift. The Naqadans were using pottery to tell stories, to depict their world, to communicate ideas beyond the purely functional. A jar painted with a boat full of people conveyed information about Nile travel, about the importance of watercraft to the culture, perhaps about voyages to specific destinations or myths involving divine journeys. The distribution of Naqada culture expanded dramatically beyond the limited Badarian range. By late Naqada I, characteristic pottery and other cultural markers appeared from the area around modern Asyut in the north down past the First Cataract in the far south, a distance of several hundred kilometers. This expansion continued through Naqada II until Naqada cultural materials were appearing even in the delta region of Lower Egypt. How did this expansion happen? The traditional model portrayed it as population movement, Naqada people spreading out and displacing or absorbing other populations. But cultural materials can spread through mechanisms other than migration. Trade networks can carry prestigious goods and the styles associated with them. Local craftspeople can copy attractive foreign designs. Intermarriage between communities can blend cultural traditions. Political alliances or dominance relationships can lead subordinate groups to adopt the material culture of more powerful neighbors.
The Naqada expansion likely involved all these mechanisms to varying degrees. At some locations, we see clear evidence of Naqada people establishing new settlements in previously unoccupied or lightly occupied areas. At others, existing communities appear to have adopted Naqada pottery styles while maintaining local architectural traditions and settlement patterns. Contemporary cultures in Lower Egypt, such as the Ma'adi culture centered near modern Cairo, maintained their own distinctive character while also participating in trade networks that connected them to both Upper Egypt and the Levant. These regional differences would eventually be swept away by Naqada expansion, but their existence reminds us that the path toward Egyptian civilization was not predetermined or inevitable. One of the most significant Naqada innovations was the intensification of agriculture through systematic irrigation. The annual flood of the Nile naturally watered fields near the river and deposited fertile silt. But communities that could control and extend this flooding could cultivate more land more reliably. By the Naqada II period, canal systems channeled floodwater to fields beyond the immediate riverbank.
Basin irrigation, creating enclosed areas that could be filled with floodwater, allowed to sit while silt settled, then drained for planting, appeared at major sites. This infrastructure required coordinated labor to dig and maintain channels, agreements about water distribution among neighboring farmers, and authority structures to resolve disputes and organize maintenance.
This agricultural intensification had cascading effects. Greater crop yields supported larger populations. More reliable food supplies freed more people to specialize in non-agricultural activities. The Naqada economy was becoming genuinely diversified in ways the Badarian had only begun to approach. Craft specialization intensified during Naqada times with workshops at major sites. At Tel El Farka in the Delta, breweries surrounded by wooden fences produced beer in industrial quantities, the fences controlling access to valuable production facilities. Similar specialized areas appear at southern sites, pottery kilns producing hundreds of vessels, zones focused on flint knapping, centers for working imported stone. The cosmetic palettes that had appeared in simple forms during Badarian times became elaborate art objects during Naqada II. Carved into the shapes of animals, turtles, hippopotamuses, fish, birds, these palettes were both functional items for grinding eye paint and symbolic objects depicting the natural world. By late Naqada and into the Predynastic period, palettes would evolve into ceremonial monuments like the Narmer palette, commemorating political and military events in carved relief.
The evidence for religious developments during the Naqada period points toward increasing formalization of belief systems. Each Naqada village apparently had its own animal deity, identified with what later Egyptian texts would call a clan ensign or standard, poles topped with symbols representing particular animals or objects. Archaeological evidence shows representation of these standards in burials and on pottery. These local totems would eventually crystallize into the nome system of later dynastic Egypt, where each administrative district maintained its traditional local deity, while also participating in the larger state religious system. The cattle cult intensified during Naqada times. Cattle received elaborate burials in some contexts, sometimes in tombs more elaborate than those of humans. These were not simply valued livestock being buried with their owners, but independent ritual acts. At certain major centers, particularly at Hierakonpolis far to the south, evidence emerges for structures that went beyond simple village architecture. Excavations at Hierakonpolis revealed a Naqada II complex built of timber and matting on a scale that dwarfs ordinary dwellings. Post holes mark where massive tree trunks supported a structure with a large oval courtyard surrounded by various buildings. The layout and scale of this complex finds its closest parallels not in contemporary village architecture, but in the ritual precincts that would be built in stone during the Old Kingdom. This Hierakonpolis structure served as a cult center dedicated to Horus, the falcon deity, who would become one of Egypt's most important gods and the divine patron of kingship. The existence of such an elaborate facility during Naqada II demonstrates that religious authority had become institutionalized enough to command the resources and labor necessary to build monumental structures. The appearance of these large ritual centers coincides with increasing evidence for political hierarchy. The richest Naqada II graves contained extraordinarily diverse assemblages, reflecting intensifying social stratification. At Naqada itself and at Hierakonpolis, certain graves from late Naqada II onward show characteristics that presage royal burials. They are larger, more elaborate in construction, positioned in prominent locations within cemeteries, and surrounded by subsidiary burials that may represent retainers or sacrifices. The intensification of contact with Mesopotamia during Naqada II brought new influences that would reshape Egyptian material culture and possibly administrative practices. Cylinder seals, a Mesopotamian invention used to mark ownership and authenticate documents, appear in Egyptian contexts. Certain architectural elements, particularly the recessed panel facades that would later characterize Egyptian monumental buildings, show clear Mesopotamian inspiration.
Artistic motifs, including exotic composite creatures, serpent-headed panthers, griffins, that have no Egyptian antecedents but match creatures from Mesopotamian iconography, begin appearing on Egyptian palettes and knife handles. These were not casual borrowings, but deliberate adoptions of foreign symbols, perhaps conveying prestige through association with distant, sophisticated cultures.
The nature and extent of this Mesopotamian influence remains debated. What seems clear is that Naqada II, Egypt was connected into a network of interaction that linked the entire eastern Mediterranean and Near East, exposing Egyptian craftspeople and leaders to developments in distant but culturally dynamic regions. The borrowing was selective rather than wholesale. Egyptians adopted specific techniques and symbols that fit their own developing cultural logic while maintaining distinctively Egyptian forms in other areas. By Naqada III, the culture had spread to encompass virtually all of Egypt. The distinctive pottery styles appeared from the Mediterranean coast to the First Cataract. Hieroglyphic writing began to develop, first as simple signs marking ownership or recording quantities, then elaborating into the complex system that would serve Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. Large mud brick structures, sometimes identified as fortresses or proto-palaces, were built at key sites. The archaeological evidence for conflict increases. Decorated artifacts showing bound captives, fortified settlements, evidence of destruction by fire at some locations. The trajectory from Badarian farming villages to Naqada III proto-states depended on specific environmental, economic, and social factors that happened to align in the Nile Valley during the 4th millennium BC. The agricultural potential of the Nile floodplain provided the foundation. The geography positioned Egypt as a crossroads for trade between Africa and Asia. The relatively narrow valley created natural territorial units that could be defended and controlled more easily than expansive plains. The Nile itself served as a highway, enabling communication and transport across hundreds of kilometers.
But potential only creates possibility. The choices made by Badarian and Naqada communities shaped how these possibilities developed. The decision to invest in irrigation infrastructure rather than remaining dependent on natural flooding. The choice to support full-time religious specialists and monumental cult centers. The acceptance of increasingly pronounced social hierarchies. Each of these choices built on previous choices, creating path dependencies that made certain subsequent developments more likely and others less so. When Narmer's mason palette depicted the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC, they commemorated a political event, the final stage of consolidation that created the First Dynasty. But that political unification was only possible because of the social, economic, religious, and technological developments of the preceding millennium. The symbolic systems that would define Egyptian civilization, the association of kingship with particular deities, the use of monumental architecture for religious and political purposes, the development of writing to record and communicate, all crystallized during the Naqada period. What mechanisms of power and coercion would transform these scattered proto-states into a unified kingdom?
The Badarian people were far more than simple farmers settling along the Nile. Between 4400 and 3800 BC, they developed sophisticated burial practices revealing complex beliefs about death and the afterlife, established trade networks reaching from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and created the social structures that would eventually support pharaonic civilization. Their cemeteries documented the emergence of pronounced inequality, as agricultural surplus enabled some families to accumulate wealth and commission specialized craft work. The debates about Badarian origins, who they were, where they came from, reflect larger questions about Africa's role in world history that continue to resonate today. What the bones and artifacts reveal is that the Badarians were neither isolated nor static. They were dynamic participants in networks of exchange and cultural transformation that connected Northeast Africa to distant worlds.
The foundations they laid in agriculture, in craft specialization, in religious symbolism, in social organization would shape the trajectory of one of humanity's most enduring civilizations. Thank you for listening.